Hello everyone and welcome to this special conversation at the Wheeler Centre about Scientology. My name is Steve Kinane and this is Tony Ortega. Thanks so much everyone for coming along. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, the Kulin people, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. Melbourne is the perfect place to be having a conversation about Scientology. It has a fascinating history here. It's the birthplace of Scientology in Australia. The first Scientology franchise was set up here in June 1955 when the Hubbard Association of Scientologists International first registered in Victoria as a foreign company. They set up shop in Spring Street across the road from Parliament House. And L. Ron Hubbard actually visited Melbourne in 1959 and he gave a series of lectures in the Bamboo Room at the Chevron. I don't know if anyone remembers the Bamboo Room. I've certainly never been there, but it sounds good. And in 1963, the first ever public inquiry into Scientology was held here in Victoria. It was run by Kevin Anderson QC. It went for over a year. A very influential report right around the world, led to other reports, led to, I believe, changes in Scientology policy. And led to Victoria becoming the first place in the world to ban Scientology. Now that ban eventually got overturned, but it was certainly the first place in the world. It was an extraordinary story in itself because Hubbard himself had great plans for Scientology in Australia. On his tour back in 1959, he said he thought Australia would become the world's first clear continent. But Victorians, when you turned on Hubbard, Hubbard turned on you. In 1967, in a document called Kangaroo Court, published by the Hubbard College of Scientology, I'm not sure if Hubbard wrote this or not, but it has a few hallmarks of his style. It said the following, this is a quote, "The foundation of Victoria consists of the riffraff of London's slums, robbers, murderers, prostitutes, fencers, thieves, the scourings of Newgate and Bedlam." In relation to the banning of Scientology, this document said, only a society founded by criminals, organised by criminals, and devoted to making people criminals could come to such a conclusion. A criminal society would applaud brutality, would regard leucotomy, lobotomy, and other major operations, depriving a being of the use of his brain as necessary to relieve a desperate situation. Now today, we are very fortunate to have with us the most well-informed journalist writing about Scientology in the world. He writes with accuracy, authority, and courage. Tony Ortega has been writing about Scientology for over 20 years. He breaks countless original stories on his website, The Underground Bunker. I recommend you all visit it and subscribe to it. He recently featured in Alex Gibney's documentary Going Clear, which won 3 Emmys. And he's just released a book called The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, which is all about Paulette Cooper, a journalist who wrote about Scientology in the 1970s, and it documents what was done to Paulette Cooper. Tony, welcome to a society founded by criminals, organised by criminals, and devoted to making people criminals. Thanks for coming here. Now, Melbourne mattered to L. Ron Hubbard, didn't it?
It sure did, and I hope you all are impressed by what Steve's been talking about because he's writing his own book about the history of Scientology in Australia, and I think he just gave you a little taste of how good it's going to be because it's going to be very, very good.
He also served in Brisbane during the war, Hubbard, and even though he told Australians that they should be grateful for the fact that he saved us from the Japanese, he was sent home for insubordination. His war record was a fictionalised account too, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, it's classic L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard was a fascinating person who lived a fascinating life. And if he had just described what actually happened to him, I think he would have done a lot better than all the embellishing he did. He had a very interesting war record. He did have command of a couple of ships, that is true. One of them was a trawler in Boston Harbor, and he was removed from command after 1 day. His bosses didn't like him very much. So then he went across, but that was, he was in the Atlantic Theater for 1 day. So then he went to the Pacific and he got command of another ship in Oregon. And they right away went out and on their first cruise, engaged in a 30-hour depth charge battle with 2 Japanese submarines, which they sank. But then the Navy brass later determined that he had spent 30 hours fighting a magnetic deposit on the seafloor. But what's interesting is some of the people who were with him to this day, and they're very old now, are convinced that they really were fighting a submarine, that there's still people trying to prove that L. Ron Hubbard had this epic battle. And I think that's interesting because, as Chris Owen points out, he's a great historian of Scientology, when the war was over, we got a hold of Japan's records, and they're not missing any submarines up there, but they're still looking for them because some people still want to prove that Hubbard was correct about that battle. But that wasn't the worst thing. On that same ship, he sailed down the coast, and he got so bored because there weren't any Japanese in the area, he opened fire on a Mexican island for target practice, and it caused an international incident. So he was removed from that command as well. But I'm sure there are many people in World War II who had various experiences. The problem is that he claimed to have been machine gunned here, right?
In the jungles of Java, he said he was machine gunned in the back by the Japanese.
And then what did he do?
He claimed that he then got into a life raft and sailed in the life raft, and I got the map out and worked out how far it was from Java to the coast of West Australia, which would be 1,600 kilometres during the monsoon season in shark-infested waters.
Right, yeah.
Which is, fishing trawlers trying to bring asylum seekers to the coast of West Australia find it difficult to make it. How would a rubber raft do it?
Well, this was the Great Thetan. But the problem is that what his war records say, that the war records don't mention machine gunning. He was hospitalized for conjunctivitis, arthritis, hemorrhoids, and an ulcer. And that's a problem for Scientology because the story that Tommy Davis tried to sell to Lawrence Wright when Larry was working on his New Yorker article was that because he was machine gunned, because he broke his back, I think something like that, his life was virtually over. He talked about that he couldn't see his life going anywhere until he came up with the ideas that became the basis of Dianetics. And he healed himself with those ideas. And that's when he decided he had this world-changing technology. And Tommy Davis actually said to Larry Wright, if this story's not true, then Dianetics doesn't exist and Scientology is all wrong. And Larry was writing this down as fast as he could. And it turns out that the war records that Scientology was trying to foist on the New Yorker were just fraudulent. And Hubbard was not.
And Tommy Davis doesn't seem to be involved anymore, does he?
Well, that was, Larry tells me that was in October 2010. And we're talking about Ann Archer's son, Tommy Davis, who from about 2006 to 2010 was a very visible spokesman for the Church of Scientology, very colorful. I still all the time get emails from people, what happened to Tommy? Where's Tommy? And Larry's article came out in February 2011, and it was a devastating article in the New Yorker, and it was clear that Tommy Davis had just been overwhelmed by Larry Wright. And what I found was that in March 2011, 1 month after Larry's article came out, the Church of Scientology International registered 2 URLs, whoistommydavis.com and whoisjessicafeshbach.com, which is what they do to you when they kick you out, is they then create anonymous smear websites about you, and that's the formula for the URL. They never did anything with those URLs, but they've got them ready in case Tommy ever turns. So but what happened was Tommy went to Texas, and he was deposed in Monique Rathman's lawsuit, and he said that he's on leave from the Sea Org, but he's still a member of the Church of Scientology. I have a really, really good source very close to him, and Tommy knows that it just irritates him that this person talks to me. But they tell me that Tommy is actually very critical of the church in private. So I think he's all the way out.
Let's move on and talk about your book, Tony. Your book on Paulette Cooper is a great read. She was a victim of something called fair game. What's fair game?
Well, I think, and maybe this is part of your book, but as a direct result of what happened here in Australia, Hubbard started to get much more paranoid and clamp down on things. And in 1965, he came up with this system of ethics. It's such a wonderful Orwellian term. By ethics, he means obedience and discipline. And there were severe rules for people who broke that obedience and discipline. And anybody that was either cast out of Scientology or had criticized Scientology would then be subject of fair game, which was their term for trying to destroy somebody that was saying something negative about Scientology. And Scientology today will tell you that policy's been canceled, but it's not. It hasn't. People are going through fair game today. But I was interested in Paulette because I had, anybody that works on Scientology, you learn pretty quickly about the story of Paulette Cooper, right? Nobody had been through a worse fair game program than Paulette. So I was aware of that, and I stumbled into Scientology. I was a new reporter in Phoenix, Arizona. I had found this interesting story about a local guy named Rick Ross, who's an internationally known cult expert. And Scientology was just one of the groups that he was tangling with, and I did a story on that. And I was fortunate I worked for the kind of publication that allowed me to follow up on stories, develop sources, and so one story led to another. And I then moved back to Los Angeles, where I'm from, which it was really great to be there because then that's one of the world headquarters for Scientology. And so I got to do stories on people like Tori Chrisman and Graham Barry, and I started to get emails from somebody that was just very encouraging, saying, your stories are good, keep at it, kid, good job. And the name on the email was Paulette. And I thought, that couldn't be, but it was. It was Paulette Cooper. And I knew that she had kind of gone quiet after her lawsuits were settled, but this showed me that she was still interested in the field. She was watching to see what people were doing. And it was just very inspirational for me to get that kind of encouragement from her. And then years later, the company I worked for moved me around a lot. I ended up in New York. I was editor-in-chief of the Village Voice, and everything changed because of this not very tall actor named Tom Cruise. This video leaked to the internet in January 2008, featuring him in a turtleneck. You've probably all seen it, talking about how great it is to be a Scientologist and only Scientologists can help at the scene of a car accident, which nobody understands what he's talking about. And that got leaked in January 2008, and Scientology characteristically tried to suppress it. And the internet struck back in the form of Anonymous. Well, for somebody that had been writing about Scientology for a long time, this was so exciting to me. And because I had stories that I'd never published that now I knew there was an audience for. The audiences were just ravenous for anything about Scientology. So over the next couple of years, I started to write about Scientology again, and there were some really interesting other things going on. Jason Begay made his video. He was a character actor he was the first Scientology celebrity to come out and talk about it in a negative way. Scientology relies on its celebrities, and this was an interesting turn of events. And then some of the top executives were starting to leave Scientology and talk, including a man named Marty Rathbun. So I was watching all this and doing a few stories. And then in May 2011 is when somebody reached out to me and said that Paulette Cooper was very angry that Tom Cruise was going to get a Humanitarian of the Year award from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And Paulette's Jewish, and so she was not happy about this. And I said, and they asked me, would you be interested in publishing a statement she's going to make about that? I said, sure. So this kind of reconnected us, and I was, I reminded her, do you remember 10 years ago you sent me emails and encouraging me? Oh, sure. So I put together a story about her statement, and it was the most read thing I've ever written. It just exploded on the internet, and Steve, I was so excited. It had 300 comments on it.
That was a lot back then, wasn't it?
I'd never had something with 300 comments. Now, today, if I wrote something and it only had 300 comments, I'd be really bummed out. But back then, that was a lot of comments. So that got us talking again, the two of us. And later that year, I thought, I'd just like to do a basic story about what she went through and remind people who she was. She had written a book about Scientology in 1971 called The Scandal of Scientology. Scientology had then put her through multiple operations trying to destroy her. She was actually facing prison at one time for a crime they framed her for. And this is when I started to realize that although all of us seem to know this story, the details were really murky, and there was a lot of bad information online. At that time, Wikipedia said that Paulette Cooper was born in the Auschwitz death camp, which was not true. And in fact, after this, I did a basic story about her harassment, and then she came to New York, and we met for the first time in December 2011. We were having breakfast, and she mentioned she was in town visiting her sister Susie. She has an older sister, Susie. And I asked what they'd been talking about, and she said, well, you know what? We were talking about the fact that we're still not sure how we survived the Holocaust. I thought, wow. So I included that just as a line in a little story I wrote for about that meeting. And the nice thing about the reach of the Village Voice is within a week it was front page news in Belgium and the Netherlands that she couldn't remember. She was born in Belgium, not Auschwitz. And so she started to get emails from people over there, including a man named Peter de Hoo, who said, listen, my father knew your father. I know how you survived the Holocaust. And she put him in touch with me. And it was a fascinating story. And he had the documents to prove that what he was saying. So what I found out was that Paulette was born to Chaim and Rukla Buchholz, who emigrated from Poland in the late 1920s to Antwerp. And Belgium fell to the Nazis in 1940. Now, in the first parts of the war, the first couple of years, if you were a Jew and you were arrested on the street, if you could prove that you were Belgian, they would leave you alone. But if you were a Polish Jew or a German Jew and you had emigrated there, you were taken to the concentration camp. That's the early part of the war. Later, all the Jews were pulled away. But at least in that first part, her parents were in danger because they weren't Belgian. And we're very, very fortunate because the Nazis were incredible bureaucrats. They kept records of everything. And so I was able to find that Chaim Buchholz was arrested. He was pulled off a train on July 22nd, 1942. And as soon as I saw that date, my heart sunk. Because I knew that Paulette was born on July 26, 1942. And so I had to break it to her, and she learned for the first time that her father had never actually laid eyes on her. He was sent to a concentration camp, and then he was moved to a transit camp. He was one of the first Jews moved there. It's called the Mechelen Transit Camp. And it ended up sending most of Belgium's Jews to their deaths. And again, we have these records. We have his train number that he was sent to the Auschwitz death camp. 3 months later, Rukla was arrested. And she ended up at the Mechelen Transit Camp. And again, we have her passenger number for the train that took her to Auschwitz. The two little girls were then kept hidden by other family members, but eventually in July 1943, they were sent to the Mechelen Transit Camp. And we have the train and the passenger numbers for these two little girls that were going to be sent to Auschwitz. But it didn't happen. And so we asked Peter what happened. And so he explained that, and this was a matter of record, that the commandant of that transit camp was a notoriously sadistic but also corrupt Nazi guard named Philip Schmidt. He was so corrupt, he'd already been disciplined by the Nazis and was scheduled to be transferred. But he was still there when Peter's father and two other friends raised a lot of cash and black market goods and bribed Philip Schmidt. So we have the record of the girls going to Auschwitz, but then a month later we have the record of them in an orphanage. So the bribe had worked. And that's how that's how close the two girls came to being sent to their deaths.
It's an incredible story. Of course, Paulette was adopted by American parents. She moved to the US. She ends up growing up in the US, moves to New York City, starts as a journalist. How did she start writing about Scientology?
You know, she wanted, she was an ambitious gal, you know. She really wanted to write magazine articles and books that got a lot of attention.
And she got noticed, didn't she? Just to remind people, that's what Paulette looked like about 1970 in New York City.
Very attractive young woman. She'd been in advertising. She was getting into magazines. She wanted to be noticed. And, I mean, just to give you an idea of one of the articles she worked on, her adoptive father was in the diamond business, and so they would go to Antwerp every year on cruise ships. And so she got very used to what life was like on cruise ships in the 60s. And so what she noticed was that she was on a cruise ship, and a young man was arrested for hiding on the ship as a stowaway. And she was telling her friends, she said, "You ever notice that there's all the stowaways in history are all men, and that this guy's problem was that he was hiding." If you wanted to be a stowaway, you need to walk around in public and act like you own the place. Then everyone will assume you have a ticket. And so in January 1970, Paulette Cooper became the first woman in history to stow away a modern cruise liner. She went on the Leonardo da Vinci as it sailed down to the Caribbean and back for a week without a ticket. And she ended up writing that story for the Washington Post and for the London Sunday Times, which gave her a 6,000-word article with a 2-page spread of her in a bikini, which in 1970 was not, not everybody wore a bikini yet. So she fit the whole image of a glamorous Manhattan freelance writer, and that's the kind of thing she wanted to do. She wanted to write something that would really impact people. And so one day she ran into a friend of hers who had been doing some Scientology, and he mentioned to her that, in Scientology, you go into your past lives to find out what you were doing thousands and millions of years ago. And so this process had allowed him to remember that he had been Jesus Christ. And so she knew that another person that the two of them used to work together, that he had also gotten into Scientology. So she called him up. And this is what actually surprised her the most was she called this other guy, a very smart guy, advertising executive, and described what this guy had said, and that he said he was Jesus Christ and he learned through Scientology. And he said, you were in Scientology, what do you think of that? And she couldn't believe it. He said, well, maybe he is. And that's when she was like, I got to figure out what this Scientology thing is. So she took a class. She signed up for the communications course at the New York Org, which in those days was at the Hotel Martinique, about a block from the Empire State Building. And, in 1960, this was 68, it was thriving then, you talk to old timers and the big ballroom was just full of people bull baiting, right, all day. And all under this giant black and white picture of L. Ron Hubbard on the wall. And so she got a real impression of it and started working.
And she found out that her first piece on Scientology was published in a UK magazine when she started to get certain types of phone calls. Yeah,
she finished her story and gave it to her agent. This was back when magazine writers had agents. And he tried to place it for her. And it was already obvious to magazines that this Scientology thing was very litigious and not everybody wanted to do a story. So they were having a hard time. And one of the magazines they submitted it to was called Queen. It was in London. It was near the end of its existence, but it was a real swinging hot magazine at the time. And they said, no, thank you. But they liked what they saw, and they said, but Paulette should submit some work to us that we'll consider to give her assignments in the future. So being cheeky, she sent them the Scientology thing again as her sample, and this time they decided to publish it. So all she knew was that it was going to be coming out in Queen. She didn't know when. But then suddenly one day in late 1969, she got death threats from 2 different men on the same day. And they said, if you will be killed if you write about Scientology again. And she called up her agent and said, what's going on? And he said, oh yeah, your magazine article came out today. And that's when it started. And she had, by that time, she'd already decided to turn that material into a book. And she tried very hard to get it to Random House, and they were fairly interested. But ultimately, she settled for Tower, which was a paperback publisher. But that was good because they printed a lot of copies. And it came out on June 1st, 1971, The Scandal of Scientology. But already by then, she was under surveillance. She was being harassed. It just was nonstop.
And just to give you a little insight into an Australian angle to Paulette's book, she got her hands on a copy of the Anderson Report based in Melbourne, courtesy of may have been a US State Department official who basically said, there's a document on this table here. I'm leaving the room. If when I leave the room, that document's no longer there, that's okay by me. So she got a copy of it, and she knows that copy spread right around the US because she had a certain style of notation in the margins and underlining words and the like, and she would see photocopies of this report cycling around.
And that story is in your TV report about her, but unfortunately it's not in my book because I have a London publisher, and he's very brave. But there were a couple of little things we decided not to put in the book, and that story unfortunately didn't make the cut. I was bummed out.
Lay out the operations that she was subjected to.
They tried multiple things. Scientology had a spy wing, and I don't know how many churches here in Australia have spy wings, but Scientology at that time had something called the Guardian's Office. Today it's called the Office of Special Affairs. And they assumed that most people would just go away with some minimal harassment. So when they first started to harass her, they did things like spread rumors about her sex life around town, wrote things about her on bathroom walls in bars around the city, just inundated her with obscene phone calls. They signed her up for pornographic magazines. And that, that might have spooked some people, but Paulette didn't just come out with that book. She would go on television, she would go on radio at the time, and she was recruiting other journalists to write about Scientology.
And her name was in the phone book, and she was a person who people would ring who was struggling to leave Scientology as well, wasn't she?
For years, people would call her up, my son or my daughter's involved, and so she became this hub of information. So that initial thing didn't work, so then they started spreading around these flyers about her, and letters, vile lies about her sex life.
Tell us what they did with her apartment block.
Well, she had moved to this luxurious 34-story building on 40th Street that she wanted to move into for a long time. And in December 72, might be January 73, this letter just showed up in the building, and everybody in the building got the letter calling her a prostitute, saying that she'd molested a 2-year-old girl, all this just vile lies. And again, most people would get the message and just stop, but she wouldn't stop.
Why wouldn't she back down?
She's talked to me about how it had something to do with her parents, that she felt that if more people had spoken up in Europe in the 30s, maybe things might have turned out differently. And she saw in Scientology an organization with totalitarian tendencies, and felt that, she really needed to get the word out about this organization. And then I think the more they went after her, the more it motivated her to keep doing what she was doing. And then you can see I'm very fortunate, the FBI years later raided Scientology, and we have all these records. And you can see in their records that it's exasperating them. They can't understand why they haven't been able to shut her up yet. And finally in 1972, one of the spies at the Guardian's office literally writes, "It's time to get her committed." And what they did was they got her fingerprint on a piece of paper, typed up a bomb threat to themselves, mailed it to themselves, and then called the FBI. And the FBI took it seriously, and in May 1973, she was indicted and faced 15 years in federal prison and a $15,000 fine for sending bomb threats and lying about it. Her trial was scheduled for Halloween, October 31st, 1973, and through that summer was the worst period of her life. And it wasn't enough for Scientology to get her framed for a felony she didn't commit. They wanted to see how badly she was suffering. So they would send spies to the building to try to befriend her, and she was a very trusting person somehow, and she became very good friends with a woman that moved in to the building, and then she brought her around her buddy Jerry, and then when she was having a hard time just getting anything done that summer, they said, "Hey, maybe Jerry could move in with you and help you out." And so from May to September 1973, this man named Jerry Levin lived with Paulette Cooper, and each night he would go up to the roof where there was a payphone and call the Church of Scientology and tell them everything she had done that day.
How did they get the fingerprints on a piece of stationery?
Well, we're fortunate because eventually that prosecution didn't happen, and she was exonerated when the FBI found documents, showing the planning of that. But they did it again in 1976. After that prosecution didn't happen, they planned a whole new operation against her in April 1976 called Operation Freakout. I think the full name was Operation PC Freakout. It was for Paulette Cooper, and it was a similar kind of operation to make it look like Paulette was becoming psychotic. And there were 6 channels to it, and one of them involved getting her fingerprint. And this time they really spelled out how you do it. And what you do is you give somebody something to read on a clipboard and they don't know that there's a piece of paper taped to the other side. So you grab the clipboard, In December 72, it was a petition she signed. In 1976, it was a joke for her to read. But each time, see, her finger touches the piece of paper she doesn't see, and then it explains, now when you take that back from her, you immediately put a piece of paper over that so your fingerprints don't get on it, see? And they actually step by step explain now how to take that off, fold it together, keep the fingerprint inside. I mean, it's really explicit. And they did that part, the fingerprint on the joke, and then they also developed somebody to sound like her and make phone calls. But the rest of Operation Freakout never came off. But they ran other operations against her into the 80s. And we found, she didn't realize this, they were keeping tabs on her until at least 2010.
Tell us about the person she lunched with.
Yeah, and the way I found out about that was I was in Florida. She lives in Florida now, and I went down there to interview her. And we were just taking a break. It was hard for her to talk about 1973. She's still very angry about all of that. She came this close to killing herself that summer because she didn't want to go through the trial. And so we were taking a break, and we were talking about New York. And she said, "Yeah, you know, Tony, whenever I come to New York, I always get together with my friend, whose name I'm not going to say right now, and we talk about various things. And he always asks me about Scientology and what I've heard, and what's going on." And she saw my jaw drop open. And she said, "Tony, what is it?" I said, "You didn't know he's been outed as a Scientology spy?" And sure enough, this was a staff writer for Vanity Fair, and two top former Scientology executives that year in 2010 revealed that he'd been on the payroll for years. And what he would do is he would call other journalists to ask them what they were working on, and then deliver that news to Scientology. And nobody ever noticed that the guy never wrote a story about Scientology himself.
You mentioned that Paulette nearly took her own life. It took a terrible toll on her, even to the extent, if you think about it, she's a young single woman in New York City. She can't even go on a date with someone without thinking, is this person a spy?
Well, I mean, there was Jerry Levin that was in her own apartment living with her. And then several years later, she went to work for a guy that turned out to be a Scientology spy. It was very difficult for her to date guys and trust people. The nice thing was, in 1987, she was invited by a friend to a party and bumped into a guy that she had dated in 68. And so she thought, okay, now this guy is okay. I knew him before the Scientology thing. And she and Paul Noble were married in 1988, and they're very happy today. He's a great guy. As Mike Rinder once said, if you're having a party, you need to invite Paul Noble.
Okay, in about 10 minutes' time, we're going to take some questions. And I know that some people, I just want to declare that this is being filmed. So if you're concerned about being filmed, maybe best not ask a question, but we'd love to get some questions in about 10 minutes' time. Tony, tell us, I want you to respond to this. And the Church of Scientology, I know when I ran the story about you and Paulette, they said that was a rogue unit. Those days are gone. That kind of thing doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, and that's what they've always said about the Guardian's office. So the FBI raided Scientology in 1977. In 1979, there was a trial, and 11 top Scientologists went to prison, including Mary Sue Hubbard, the wife of the founder. And Hubbard himself was named an unindicted co-conspirator. They then disbanded the Guardian's office and replaced it with something called the Office of Special Affairs. They claimed the Guardian's unit was this rogue unit. But it's very clear that Mary Sue and LRH, L. Ron Hubbard, were in charge of what was going on. This was not a unit off doing its own thing. And then the question becomes, okay, the Office of Special Affairs today clearly spies on people, but have they really reformed and they don't do illegal things? Well, this book came out, it hit Amazon on May 14th this year. 10 days later, on May 24th, I was notified by the U.S. Attorney's Office that they were about to sentence a private investigator in New York to prison, and they were notifying the people he had victimized with illegal hacking. I was one, and it turned out so was Mike Rinder, the former top spokesman of the Church of Scientology. So Mike and I had little doubt who was paying this guy, but eventually the New York Times reported that, yes, this guy who just went to prison was working for the Church of Scientology. So 10 days after I came out with a book about the illegal techniques used by the Church of Scientology to try to harm Paulette Cooper, I found out about the illegal techniques they were using to try to harm me. So I would say Scientologists themselves have made a pretty good case that they really haven't changed at all.
So they admit it was a rogue unit. So they seem to be distancing themselves from the activities against Paulette. But have they ever apologized?
Never, and she's bitter about that. One of the things we set out to do was to try to find some of these people who had run some of these operations against her, and I did talk to several of them. And I have a wide variety of reactions. I mean, I met one person came forward and apologized to her. He told her how bad he felt years later that he had been involved in some of these operations. Others were willing to talk to me, but they wanted to make it clear that they still hated her guts 40 years later. And others just wouldn't talk to me and told me to F myself, that kind of thing. So it was an interesting variety.
Okay, so why won't they apologize? We've seen the Catholic Church, we've seen the Pope abused for the way the Catholic Church, he's apologized for the way the Catholic Church has dealt with abuse.
No, that's a great question. Why haven't they apologized?
Why won't they apologize? Is there no reconciliation?
There is no apology in Scientology. I mean, one thing to keep.
Why not? Is there something in their doctrine? Is there something in their history? What is it?
Keep in mind that what Scientology is really all about is these people believe they have the answer to the existence of mankind and the secrets of the universe, and the rest of us are pathetic dopes that don't understand anything. Why, if you consider yourself a superior brand of human being, would you ever apologize to the rest of us since we know nothing?
Because we're all human and we all make mistakes and we're flawed. Why don't they apologize?
Scientologists do not make mistakes. They either follow L. Ron Hubbard's technology standardly and correctly, or they don't. And that's all the answer to all the problems in your life. See, Scientologists, even I know some people leave Scientology, especially these days, and say that it's all David Miscavige, that's the current leader is really behind all the problems, and things were great under L. Ron Hubbard. But really, it was Hubbard's paranoia, it was Hubbard's attitudes about Scientology's superior nature that's baked into Scientology. And you just don't apologize if you're a Scientologist.
How much does the Church of Scientology spend on surveillance?
Oh, my goodness. Marty Rathbun estimates that the money they spent just in the Lisa McPherson case to try to bribe judges, affect the state prosecution of that case, that case alone cost them $30 million. And recently, two private investigators were arrested in Wisconsin who David Miscavige was paying $10,000 a week to follow his father, who recently left Scientology. Money's no object for Scientology. They will spend whatever it takes to follow people, to try to win litigation. And, again, they can't change, Steve, because this is one of the things that I find most fascinating about Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard is called Source. He is the source of all knowledge. Scientology has the answers for everything in life. And he died in 1986. They can't change anything.
So you can't have a reformation.
You can't have a reformation. You can't change anything he wrote. Now, some will tell you that David Miscavige is squirreling the tech, but he is making some changes. But the playbook they're operating from, as far as critics go, journalists, ex-members, comes right out of what Hubbard wrote in the 60s.
Pat and Annie Broker, how much money was spent on spying on them?
Yeah, when Hubbard died in 1986, he appeared to have anointed a man named Pat Broker and his wife Annie to succeed him. It's a little unclear, but he promoted them in an interesting way. Then he died. This young man named David Miscavige pushed the Brokers out of the way and became the leader, but he was very paranoid about what Pat Broker might say or do. And so they hired two ex-cops to follow Pat Broker, and they couldn't be seen. To journalists, they tend to do noisy investigations where we know they're following us. But this Pat Broker was not supposed to know he was being followed. These two ex-cops followed him 24 hours a day for 24 years. The operation cost $12 million. And then they finally lost their jobs 2 years ago, and they claimed they had been told they had jobs for life, so they sued Scientology. And for one day they talked, and I flew to Texas just to meet them, and I had them to myself for a day, and then the Tampa Bay Times guys had them for a few hours the next day, and I had so much fun because they were proud of the work they did. Oh yeah, we would get up next to him at Applebee's and look over his shoulder at his emails, and I mean, because they couldn't be discovered. That was the number one thing. And the same thing with these guys in Wisconsin. They knew that $10,000 a week ends if they were ever discovered. And for them, the real crisis moment came when they were following Ron Miscavige Sr., David's dad. And one day, Ron was walking across a Walmart parking lot, and I'm told that you don't have Walmart here, but you might have Kmart's, right? Okay, so a big parking lot, and he's walking across, and he does this. Now, what was happening was Ron's smartphone was falling out of his pocket, and he was clutching at it. But he was a 77-year-old man clutching his chest and bending over. So these two, now, this is a real crisis for these guys, because remember, they're getting paid $10,000 a week not to be discovered. Now, do we run over and help this guy or not? So what they did was, being the humanitarians they were, they called their handlers in Florida. And they told the police that within a minute, David Miscavige picked up the phone. And he told them, if he dies, he dies. Don't do anything. And that is now going to be the title of Ron's memoir coming out next year, If He Dies, He Dies.
Tony, should a church get tax-free status if they're spending millions of dollars a year on surveillance and intimidating critics?
Well, look, I mean, there are some people who feel that any churches shouldn't get any tax-exempt status. But the point with Scientology is they signed an agreement. They signed an agreement with the IRS in 1993, and it's very explicit about the conditions under which that tax-exempt status can be revoked. And they are in violation of it every single day. I personally would love to see the IRS ask David Miscavige to explain how spending $10,000 a week to have two men follow his father is a religious purpose. Wouldn't that be an interesting conversation? I'd like to see him justify that.
Alex Gibney, the director of Going Clear, the Academy Award-winning documentary maker, Emmy Award-winning documentary maker from Going Clear, he's very keen on something to happen about this IRS status. Is that likely to move in the US where they lose their tax-free status?
I think the IRS has some interest in revisiting it, but it would be such a mountain to move. I mean, just this week, the Netherlands decided that Scientology should not get tax-exempt status, and Alex then tweeted, if they can do it in the Netherlands, why can't we do it in the United States? Mike Rinder, the former top spokesman for Scientology, told me that one thing to keep in mind is if you're an agency head in the United States, and whether it's the IRS or the FBI or whatever, and you decide, okay, we're gonna look into this Scientology thing and make some decisions. He said, you have to make a calculation. You have to decide whether you're ready for that to be the rest of your career, because it will be. They will throw waves of attorneys at you. And, I think there is some interest at the IRS. I hear some things, but I think it would take a lot of public interest. And, maybe the movie Going Clear is starting to get us part of the way there.
On the issue of Going Clear, the members of the Academy are getting some interesting letters at the moment, aren't they?
Scientology. So Going Clear one, I'm very fortunate that I'm in it. It's really Alex and Larry's movie, and I'm very fortunate they included me.
Yeah, but it's a great credit to your work, Tony, that they asked you to be a part of that.
Well, Larry's book, if you've read it, is a magnificent book, but it stops in 2010. And then I've done a lot of reporting in the last few years, and I think, they liked that, and they had me talking about Tom Cruise. That was fun. So, but when you win, so this is an HBO, which I think is something like Foxtel, right? A pay kind of. No. People here know what HBO is, right?
Yeah, people know what HBO is, yeah.
So what they did was they debuted it at the Sundance Film Festival in Utah in January. Then they opened it in theaters in March to make it eligible for Oscars. Then they showed it on HBO in March, which made it eligible for Emmys. So it was nominated for 7 Emmys. It won the 3 big ones: Best Documentary, Best Direction, Best Writing. And some people, I remember reading The Real Experts in Hollywood, this is not my beat, that winning an Emmy can actually hurt your Oscar chances, because then the Oscar voters think of your movie as a TV movie. But in this case, I personally think there's a lot of people in Hollywood that have not enjoyed the fact that Scientology has thrown its weight around town for so long and would be anxious to vote for this. So let's see how it does. Well, Scientology is also concerned about that. So they had a reporter for their propaganda magazine, Freedom, call up key Oscar members in the documentary division to try to poison it, to pretend he was interviewing them about the film. But did you know there are controversies about this film? Do you know that there's stuff in here that's not true? Just to try to plant that seed with the Oscar committee, but it backfired on them because they knew what was going on. And now, if anything, all it's done is given Alex Gibney a whole new round of free publicity for the church. Church is often its own worst enemy with those kind of things.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the floor. So if you've got a question, put your hand up. And there's one down here, and there's a couple down the front. And we will get a microphone to you and ask away. First question.
This is actually pretty much for both of you, but given that Scientology has shown itself to actually be criminal, in addition to all the other things, I can kind of understand that the United States can be a bit squeamish about religion and the Constitution. And you mentioned that the head of the IRS would have a personal battle. I'm really interested to know why it's been allowed to be a criminal organisation and not be investigated from the point of view of tax. And the second half is to Steve. Australians aren't squeamish. We don't bloody care. So why is the Australian government being so light-fingered about dealing with Scientology?
Are you talking about tax-free status? Or?
Yes, principally.
Okay, well, the tax-free, if I take that one first, there was a 1983 High Court judgment, and it's a very complicated case and how it started, but it went through the local Victorian courts, and it was about payroll tax and the like, and it ended up going to the High Court. And the decision was basically, and I actually think the decision was right, that the state should not dictate what people can and can't believe in. There are all kinds of crazy beliefs that religions are based around, and we all have a right to believe or not believe. And I don't actually have a problem with that judgment. I think there's a question mark, though, about tax-free status on religions, and if you can show that religion causes harm or spends money on placing critics under surveillance, then I think you can bring in what's called, and Nick Xenophon has talked about this, a public interest test. And you can weigh up whether that institution, that religious institution, deserves to have tax-free status or not. But I don't think you should be banning religions, and I think it was wrong for Victoria to ban Scientology. But I think that is what you could do. You could follow that measure that Nick Xenophon was very keen to get up. But it won't get up, and I think one of the reasons is that there's a lot of religious people in Parliament, and they'd be concerned that would apply to their institutionalised religions like the Catholic Church, given the revelations of abuse in the last decade, that perhaps that could backfire on them as well. So I don't think that's ever going to get up. Is there another aspect that you think they should be investigated about, or are you just talking about the tax?
Well, as far as the criminality is concerned, the number one problem that law enforcement has is that it can often take so long for Scientologists to even realize they've been victimized. They come out, and it takes so many years to get off of that indoctrination. There's a really fascinating case going on right now in Los Angeles, a young woman who's suing Scientology. She signed the Sea Org's billion-year contract at 12 years old and was immediately put on a schedule of 98 hours of work a week for pennies an hour. And the next year, when she turned 13, they moved her up to 112 hours a week, again for pennies an hour. And she was disciplined at one point when she was 12 because she dared to write down in a note that she missed her mother. Okay, and not only were they violating labor laws with the way they treat children, but she ended up at 17, she got pregnant. Now it's against the Sea Organization's rules to have children. And her story is she was forced to have an abortion, like so many other women who have come forward and said the same thing. So she went through things that were horrific in her mind, but it took her 5 years after she left to realize, hey, wait a minute, that was wrong for them to treat me that way. I need to sue them. And so for the last 6 years, most of her lawsuit has simply been about, did she wait too long or not? And I talk to law enforcement people sometime, and they always tell me that's the number one thing, is people will come forward to them with allegations of sexual abuse, of covering up of sexual abuse, of families being ripped apart. And the first question they ask is, how long ago was it? And often it's like 5, 6, 7 years before somebody will say anything. Just the other day, a man came forward to me. He couldn't wait to tell me a story about Scientology. Let me tell you about the horrible things that happened to me in Los Angeles. And they were all things I'd heard before, but it sounded interesting. This sounds like a good story. When was this? The year 2000. It took him 15 years to be ready to tell his story. That's the number one thing law enforcement complains
And certainly
about.
prosecutors also say that it's much harder to prove things the further away it is, and evidence becomes more unreliable. It's very difficult. We should probably move on to another question. We'll go to our second question.
Thanks. You've already answered the first part of my question, which was about the tax-free status. But the other question for Steve is what's their membership like in Australia now? What sort of, how active are they?
Okay, well, Tommy Davis said on Four Corners when he was still in the Church of Scientology in 2009, there was tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Scientologists in Australia. All I can go by is the last census, which said 2,107. Now, I am assuming if you're a Scientologist, you want your stats up, don't you, Tony? So everybody would be told, I would think, to make sure you put down in the census that you are a Scientologist.
And that's very consistent with what we see in the rest of the world. England's census said 2,300, and a sort of informal census taken in the United States said 25,000. I think there's maybe something like 40,000 active Scientologists around the world. And the top former executives who had access to actual enrollment documents tell me that the largest Scientology ever was about the year 1990, when there were about 100,000 Scientologists. There have never been the millions that they claim. In 1969, they told a reporter in New York that they had 15 million people. And Kirstie Alley has said 20 million. But it's just not, there's no hard evidence that there are those kinds of numbers.
And Tony, one of the things I find fascinating about it is that it's a very statistics-driven institution, and each Thursday you're meant to improve your statistics. So it's almost like they have to say that they are the fastest-growing religion in the world, that things are improving all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. Third question.
Here we go.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
Oh, I don't need to stand up, do I? So I almost hesitate to raise a question because I'm maybe the only Scientologist in the room. So I'm here to listen and to
Well,
engage.
thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for letting me in. So I just wanted to, you and I have spoken before.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to just put it to you, maybe just pose a hypothetical question. What if everything you talked about and everything you're trying to do, what if it was listened to? And what if the church did change in some way, let's say just some aspects? Would you, as a journalist, as a professional journalist, would you be able to write about that? Or have you already gone too far down the road of being a critic?
I'm always waiting for the changes to come. I'd love to report them. For me, the most basic thing that Scientology could do is simply talk about itself. Why can't Scientology describe itself publicly? Scientologists are trained to say only, buy a book and find out for yourself. Why can't Scientologists talk about auditing? Why do you have to be several years in and several $100,000 in before you find out that on the upper levels you're going to be spending $800 an hour to rid yourself of body thetans? This is the ultimate aim of Scientology, that you will be spending money to rid yourself of invisible alien beings that were left from 75 million years ago, genocide. That is what Scientology is. Why can't Scientologists describe that? Because otherwise it's a big bait and switch. The day Scientology does that, I will celebrate it. I would be happy to say Scientology has made the correct step forward. But they don't do that. They follow the same playbook from 1965. And the kind of reforms you're describing, those are happening on the outside. Some independents are trying to make some of those changes, and I think they're interesting. But until the organization itself does, it's really frustrating.
And on a personal note, that time I had a conversation with you, I personally found you the most open-minded Scientologist that I had spoken to, and were willing to think and answer questions that I had dealings with. I have real problems talking to the people up the top of the hierarchy of the Church of Scientology in Australia. They've not granted me an interview since, I think it was 2010, despite repeated requests. I'm writing a book at the moment. I asked them to line up interviews. I've asked, they just won't play ball. So I consider myself very open-minded. I'm trained as a journalist to be fair, to try and get all sides of the story. But you know what happens? when I do reporting on Scientology, they don't put people up for interview, but what they often do is hand me a whole bunch of affidavits where somebody says, this never happened, signed so-and-so, and then when I ring them up, and this is predominantly in the US, I ring them up and say, can I speak to that person who signed that affidavit? I'd like to test their claim. They never make them available. The ex-Scientologists I speak to always make themselves available for me to test their claims. And I will test their claims. I will say, well, what about this? What about that? You know, how do I know you're not lying? You've got to, you know, show me some evidence here. And they'll often find corroborating evidence. So I am very open-minded to hearing other sides of the argument. I personally find it very difficult to get access to that information.
Well, and let me clear up a misconception. Scientology will tell you that we are not talking to the official channels in Scientology, but it's a myth that we don't talk to Scientologists. I've been doing this for 20 years. I have sources inside the Church of Scientology.
Yeah.
And these are people who are very frustrated with how things are going. Otherwise, they wouldn't be talking to me, right? So I talk to Scientologists all the time. Scientologists in the organization, people who have left the organization but still consider themselves Scientologists, which is really an interesting phenomenon. Imagine, you know, a Catholic decides to leave the local parish but still wants to call themselves a Catholic. Can you imagine the church saying, no, they're not a Catholic. That's illegal to call yourself a Catholic. But that's what Scientology does. So I talk to a lot of Scientologists in the organization and out. We just don't get to talk to the top leaders.
And we can't talk to them on the record because their internal justice system punishes speaking out against Scientology. So we would then imperil them if we quoted them on the record.
Yeah. Let's get another one.
There's another question down the front here.
What is it about Scientology that attracts people to it?
Well, you know, Scientology has always only appealed to a small percentage of people. But I think the thing that is most appealing about it is they're selling certainty. They go to people particularly people who've had some kind of problems in their lives, and they say, we have a program to make your life better. All you need to do is take our courses, fill out these check sheets, and you will become a better human being. Now, that doesn't work with me. I know life doesn't work like that. Life is difficult. We all have setbacks, and you do the best you can. There's no magic formula in a check sheet and in a lecture by some guy from 1950. But there are a certain small number of people who like that I pay my check, I get the course materials, I fill it out, and now suddenly my life, I'm a superhuman. And that's always appealed to a certain small number of people. And even today, I know Scientology has a harder time today because of the internet. It's not able to recruit people the way it used to because Scientology is all about information control. But there are still some people that find that intriguing, that this group claims that they can solve virtually any problem, cure virtually any disease, and all you have to do is take their courses, listen to their lectures, and fill out their check sheets. That is attractive to some people, but it's never been a large, group.
But
and pay the money, not too much at first, but again, you get to those upper levels and you're paying $800 or $900 an hour.
I was we did an event in Sydney the other night, and a question was asked: what's in common about people who are recruited to Scientology? And our consensus on the panel was that somebody with a vulnerability. And Hubbard used to say, find their ruin. So when you recruit somebody, you find their ruin. Their ruin. What is wrong with them? And Joe Reish, who I've interviewed, was a first grade rugby league player in Sydney. He had a torn groin muscle that would not heal. And this is pre-modern sports medicine. Scientology said, we can solve that problem. John Atack, who wrote A Piece of Blue Sky, a very intelligent man, he got involved in Scientology because he had a relationship breakup. Bruce Hines is a similar story.
Bruce Hines was a physicist. Bruce Hines should have known that everything Hubbard says about the universe is complete poppycock. He is a physicist. He knows how the universe works. But he told me he had been through a bad breakup. I mean, they find people that have a certain vulnerability. And again, we can help you with that. We can solve that. And at first, they're not talking about superhuman powers. They're just talking about, we're going to help you communicate better, take control of your life. And that sounds attractive, right? But then, I thought Paul Haggis did a really good job in the movie Going Clear, explaining how those initial levels can really make you feel more confident and you feel like it's working. But then the later levels get stranger and stranger. I mean, on OT3, you learn that you have these invisible alien souls attached to you that you need to drive away with auditing with the E-meter. And then on OT4, you find out you have a whole other set of invisible alien souls, and they're junkies. And you need to put them through rehab. That's another $10,000. You know, how many people would join if they were upfront about that?
But I think another point is that there are people who join because they believe it and it works for them. I also think that, and when I had this conversation, I did a documentary series for the ABC a few years ago on the teenage brain. And what I learned was that before the age of 25, the frontal lobes of your brain are not fully developed. Now, they're the parts of your brain where rational behaviour sits. And if those parts of the brain are not fully developed, you rely on the amygdala, which is back towards the middle of the brain, which is about your emotions. And that is based on if it feels good, you do it. So the 3 people who asked me about this, I said, what ages did you join Scientology? 20, 21, 22. It's the same ages that the frontline soldiers in World War I were. It's the same age that people recruit suicide bombers. It's the same age that when we're young and idealistic at university and open to all kinds of different ideas. So I think there's a vulnerability too in that age group, because Scientology appeals to people who are idealistic and want to make the world a better place. Probably got time for another question up there.
In Going Clear and many other things, there's not much written or spoken about the origins of Scientology, in the sense that Hubbard, as a fairly successful science fiction writer, quite a good one, said to John Campbell, editor of Astounding magazine, who published some of his stories, and I think A.A. Van Vogt was there, saying the only way we can get rich is to invent a religion. And Astounding published the first article, which became then Dianetics a bit later on. That doesn't seem to get as much coverage, which I would have thought might have dissuaded some people from joining if they knew about it.
Actually, that was covered pretty well in Going Clear. Alex Gibney talked about that he was a successful science fiction writer who published the article about Dianetics in Astounding Science Fiction came out the same month as the book itself. And he did have champions among other science fiction writers, as you said, A.E. Van Vogt. But see, Van Vogt's a fascinating example because Van Vogt really liked the idea of Dianetics. And in Dianetics, you go back to your memories in the womb about what traumatic things happen. And I've read Dianetics cover to cover. I am seriously doubtful that most Scientologists have, because it's the most disgusting book about women. It's the most misogynistic book.
An obsession with abortion too, isn't it?
It's all about how your dad had rough sex with your mom and knocked you out with his penis during rough sex, and that's why you have these traumatic memories that 40 years later make it tough for you to get up in front of a crowd and give a speech. And so in Dianetics, your job is to go back to the womb and remember all the terrible things dad did to mom and the multiple abortion attempts your mom must have made, and remember that. And now Van Vogt thought that was cool, all right? But then he went bankrupt a year later, had to start over again. Hubbard had lost the use of the name Dianetics, so he had to start up with something new, and he called it Scientology. That he came up with in Phoenix, 1952. By then, some of his more creative followers weren't satisfied with only going back to the womb. They wanted to go farther. So in Scientology, Hubbard came up with counseling to bring up your past lives, thousands, millions, billions of years ago. Now, Van Vogt was like, wait a minute. This was a science. That's just crap you're talking about. And for the rest of his life, A.E. Van Vogt remained a dedicated Dianeticist and wouldn't go near Scientology. There are a few people that were like that thought Hubbard was on to a science in Dianetics, but this Scientology thing's crazy.
And just on that point you raise about the science fiction writers who said that Hubbard used to say the best way to make $1 million was to start your own religion. There's at least 3 people on the record who've said that.
Oh, there's no question. I actually doubted it myself. It just sounded too good to be true, and I wondered about that, but then I went and researched it. He told several different people in 48 and 49 variations of that line, that if you really want to make $1 million, start your own religion. Variations on that theme. And there were multiple...
The Church of Scientology says George Orwell said
and they
it.
recorded it at the time.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
this
it doesn't mean
is not somebody remembering 20 years later.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean the other people didn't say it as well.
Right, George Orwell did say something similar in the 30s, but that doesn't mean Hubbard said it. Right. That did happen.
I think we can squeeze in one more. Yeah, one more. Last one, down the front.
Hi. I'm wondering if either of you can explain the technicality that saw Jan Eastgate escape prosecution and why she wasn't recharged.
Okay. I can explain that because I did the story for Late Line that originally exposed that. And I will point out that when Jan Eastgate would not talk to me on the record, she would not talk to me on the phone. All she did was email me and said the claims were egregiously false. I'll also point out that I was never sued for that story, even though in that story it said that the allegation was that she had coached a young woman to lie to police and community services about her sexual abuse by her Scientologist stepfather. Now, the DPP in New South Wales did charge her with, I think it was something like pervert the course of justice, but one of the problems was that law did not exist back in 1985, so there was a mistake made in the DPP, and in fact it was conspiracy to pervert the course of justice was the law at the time, which is a higher bar to prove. We're also, once again, going back to what we said before about evidence going back a long way. We're talking 30 years. So it is the DPP, for whatever reason, decided that they didn't think that charge would get up in a court of law, so they withdrew it. But it relates to them charging her with a law that didn't exist at the time and evidence. So people who don't know, Jan Eastgate is the international president of the Citizens Commission for Human Rights, which is Scientology's anti-psychiatry organisation. So thanks very much for coming along and thanks very much for your questions.